everybody. Here again, talk to you. Actually today, I just wanted to talk about writing, actually. I've been thinking a lot about writing. I do a lot of it. I've been starting a new script and I've been wanting to work on. And basically, writing, I've been working on comic scripts for a while. So we're going to talk about basically the script writing, and if you're working on something like, say, the first, well, I call them chapters sometimes because I tend to collaborate aggregate my chapters into, I guess it'd be like an issue, if you will, if you're writing kind of a traditional comic book format. I tend to aggregate them into chapters and then kind of put them towards a full, when everything's finished, you know, especially since I'm kind of making shorter volumes, it kind of becomes its own graphic novel. So pretty much today we're talking about comic book script writing. And I tend to, I think I hate writing, I have this love-hate relationship with writing, you know, issue 1 or chapter 1, if you will. Because you have to do so much in that first chapter. You have to be able to, there's at least 2 or 3 things that you specifically have to do, and you have to be able to relate to your audience, to the readers, some sort of relatability. You know, you can't, I've read comics that are just, you open it up and you're like, what is going on? You're like, what is, you know, and it, you know, you have to like, by chapter 2 to figure out what's going on, or issue 2. But it's like, I think a good comic script should, in issue 1, really be able to relate to people. The initial, like, oh, okay, this is, you know, where people are like, oh, okay, this is what's going on, and still want them, and still, like, have them wanting more as they get into, as they get towards the end of the first chapter or issue, and then they go on to the second one. And the way you do that, I mean, you have to create enough semblance of reality, and I know they're comic books, right? Like, they don't have to be that realistic, but, you know, I think the best comic books or graphic novels out there really create this sense of reality, despite you could have the crappiest art, and I don't really mean crappy as in, like, bad art, I just mean simplistic art. You know, you could have something that it does what it's supposed to do, it tells the story, but if the writing sucks, then everything sucks. You know, I've seen graphic novels with the simplest art, but it conveys the story well enough. But the thing is, the writing is so good, who cares? You know what I mean? Like, the writing is what carries the whole thing. And I'm not saying art isn't important. Art's very important because it's, after all, still a visual medium. It's still a comic book, graphic novel. So you definitely have, I mean, let's look at Persepolis, who, that's an amazing, isn't just like, what, there's 2 of them? And then they made an animated feature film out of it, and then she's gone on to do all sorts of other things. So here's an example of art that's very simplistic. It's not crappy, it's actually pretty good art, it's just very simple. And the characters are kind of cartoony looking. But the story is real. I mean, it's autobiographical, you know. The story is what keeps you going. If it was just some kind of non-story driven thing, if it was just kind of a goofy, it wouldn't be what it is. But the story is what makes that. And then you have other examples of other sorts of comics where, you know, the art is amazing, but the story sucks. And you could kind of still keep going because the art's great, and just kind of tell yourself, well, you know, story's lame, but it's just really fun to look at. It's entertaining. It's like a good action film that's got no plot, but you watch it anyway because you're just like, this is a lot of fun. This is really cool to watch. But at the end of the day, your story is, you know, that's what's going to drive everything forward. And I think this is important too for those of you who might be great writers and might be so-so artists. Especially if you're writing and drawing your own comic book or graphic novel. So writing is important, and I guess let me get back to what I was saying, is that in the first chapter or issue, the key thing is to create a sense of reality. That you postpone the disbelief. It's the suspension of disbelief that you have to create first. You have to create a scenario that's realistic enough for people to follow, something people can relate to, whatever that is. And that may appeal to different audiences too, different age ranges. You might have a character who's like working in an office situation or something that might appeal to older audiences. You might have characters that are kids that obviously appeal to younger audiences, or even appeal to older audiences as well, who just kind of obviously remember what it was like to be a kid. But you have to make that realistic no matter what. You have to kind of make a character that is somewhat of a real person, well, in a lot of ways. I go back to Persepolis as a good example of a character who, the story takes place in Iran. As Americans, though, we still relate to the character because she's a real person. We still relate to her growing up, living in a home with parents, and having to go to school, and, all this stuff that's like everything everybody relates to. And you have to create characters like that. And that stuff seems very basic, but it can be just that simple. You just create a world in which everything is, even if you're creating a fantasy story, say your characters take place in maybe some other world, I don't know, just as an example, maybe a Lord of the Rings sort of thing. You still have to create a world, and what Tolkien did with that is that he created a world even with the hobbits. Like, how can you relate to a hobbit? Well, the fact of the matter is, on the face of it, maybe you can't, but when you actually get down to, you related to the fact that these characters were very human, and the way they interacted with each other, they're very loving, and they had their own oddities and their little kind of like cultural uniquenesses, distinctions, but you really have to look at the way that they interacted with each other, the way they the way they loved one another, the way they worked together. They gardened, and they tended to their homes, and they built their houses, and they, then they had little children, and it's like all that stuff's very real, relatable. Even in a fantasy story, you gotta create some sort of thing where it's like, oh yeah, everybody does that, It makes it harder on the person who's writing the story about a very, like a foreign, maybe an extraterrestrial culture or some sort of story like that, where you still have to find some sort of way to make a common ground that people can relate to. So there's that. You got to establish that in your first issue, and then you have to really establish character as well. And that's hard sometimes. You got to introduce your characters in a way that flows naturally, and that can be difficult when you're dealing with especially if you have difficult characters. You have to know your characters. You really do. You have to know them like they're yourself, know them like they're your best friends, and that can be hard. You have to find their voice, and their voice has to be in your head. When you're writing them, it's like you're hearing them talk and not yourself. And I'm in the middle of writing something right now where I'm just not feeling that vibe. I'm trying to write something, and I'm just not. And so that's the sort of thing that makes me put down a script and say, I'm going to return to this at some point, but right now I'm going to go down another avenue and, find something that's going to hit me as a familiarity. Because for me, when I write characters, if I don't get familiar with them within a certain given amount of time, it's kind of like when you meet someone and you try hanging out with them and you try building a friendship with them, and then you just realize we just can't seem to really click. It's like you're coming up against the wall, and that's what it feels like. If it feels that way with some characters, then you have to kind of put them on hold, or you have to just scrap it. If it really is that difficult for you to get into it, try something else. So that said, get your characters, especially initially. You gotta have at least your main character in issue 1. You've got to have that person just really be available to the audience, even if mysteriously, even if you're just kind of like baiting, the audience, even if you just really yeah, you know, you're building up tension and you're building up kind of like intrigue, and you get to the end of issue 1, and you know, you're just kind of like you're making it so, and that's a great way to do it. Like, always figure out ways to build some tension where people want to keep reading and they want to get that second issue when it comes out, because you know, keep them wanting more. That's the beauty of the entertainment side of it. But you know, you really have to, again, you have to establish characters, and you have to really develop them. I mean, it really helps to actually develop characters before you ever put them into your script. You just write about them. Just continue to write a whole backstory on them. That's the way I often start. I just kind of write about their life, and it's like I'm tapping into something that's already there. When I start writing, it's just like something that's already there. And I don't know how to explain that. It's almost like this person really exists in an alternate universe, and I'm just tapping into some cosmic energy. Not really, but it feels like that. It's almost like I'm just downloading everything that's already there, and I start writing this like bio of somebody, and I'm going, wow, okay, you know, there it is. And you know, hold on to that, because that becomes your backstory. That becomes something you can draw from in your script or in your book or in your whatever you're writing, but let's go with script here. And you can draw from it, and you can just kind of like, oh yeah, this is what happened to this character back in 1983, and then you're like, and then, you know, 4 years later this happened, and it was really a tough time, and they went through this crisis, and this is part of why they're like this now in the script, like, you know, why they're dealing with things psychologically, emotionally, you know, and just what makes them who they are. It's all about being human, especially most of us write about human characters. But again, if we're not writing about human characters, we still have to figure out what makes characters relatable, which is often the humanity, even if you're writing about an extraterrestrial character or a fantasy character that's like some otherworldly creature. But you still have to find that common thread, and most of the time it is a humanity of some sort of human-like quality. So that said, you have to establish that. And characters that are flat are just going to lie flat. They're not going to be interesting. People are going to be reading this going, wow, this character, for those who are really analytical about it, you know, this character is really stupid. I don't like this character. This is the main character, you know, and that's not going to sell. That's not going to sell your script for sure, but that's not going to keep readers going. You know, it's amazing how I know you can say, oh, I've read so many comics like that, it's so stupid, but don't you know, they got published, but honestly, don't you want to be a step above that? Don't you want to do better than that? I sure do. And I'm working on it, but this is definitely some stuff that I've learned, because I went from being more of a writer first to then doing scripts and writing and drawing comics. And so that said, it's something you need to definitely, characters that are flat are definitely just going to be, they're going to lay flat. The characters that are three-dimensional, characters that are they're going to be all about stuff that's going on here, that's not always verbalized. They're going to be about doing stuff, but that's not always verbalized, you know, so you got to have a way to be able to show how a character is and who a character is without necessarily always having the character talk about themselves, without always necessarily having to internalize everything. And you can't always, like, what gets me about, and I love manga, but what sometimes gets me about it is that a lot of times characters are far too in their head, and it drives the story. Even Suzuka, however you pronounce it, one of my favorite manga artists, and you know, the god of manga, he also had this tendency, which is very typical of a lot of manga, is to have an anime, to have characters drive the story by what's going on only in their thoughts. And it's kind of the way you follow, like, it's kind of a plot device to have multiple characters you follow. And sometimes it's effective, other times it's just horrible. And because you don't get a chance to watch a character, even in a comic book format, it's possible to do this, to have a character just being shown. You know, you can just, it's just showing what they're doing, rather than having to have the readers just always being told from a character's like mind, from a thought bubble, like what's going on, to actually see it unfold. You know, more cinematic, more like a film. When you're watching a movie, you hardly ever get what's going on in a character's head being spoken. Like you hardly ever hear their thoughts, like audibly. But you're watching what they're doing, so you're picking up on what's going on via their actions, which actions are so much more telling about who characters are than words could ever be. So you have to deal with that. So you have to establish that. You also, with establishing characters, you also have to establish time and place. You have to establish, setting. And the thing about that can be hard is you have to also find a place that's kind of somewhat realistic. I mean, even if it's a fantasy world, you have to establish some sort of place where people can kind of like really somehow relate to it. You know, like I said, if you have a situation where characters have families or characters have, that's a realistic scenario. Say your characters are relatable, but your setting isn't. The two kind of go hand in hand. If your setting isn't, your character probably isn't. But if you, as you're developing your character's backstory, and as you're developing your character's present place, you're kind of writing about what's happening to the character. And this is what you do as a writing exercise. You put together like ideas, you kind of a little biography about what your character's doing and how they live and how they work and where they're at in life. And as you're doing that, you also are building setting. I mean, that has to go hand in hand, I think. So you're building, they live here, they work here, and then, they're established doing this, so forth. You have to create a somewhat relatable, like again, it's some sort of workplace, or some sort of home life, or some sort of, whatever that looks like, If it's a fantasy world, then it's not visually going to look the same, but it has the same functions. So you got to think about functions over appearance, because appearance can look like anything, and that's what's the beauty of the comic book format is then you can have function be like let's look at the Shire, for example. If someone would do a comic book of Lord of the Rings, the Shire is just, you've seen the movies, it's this beautiful, all the homes are like these cool little round hills, and at first glance it's almost like this alien world in a very kind of British sort of sense. But it's interesting because everything's functional in a way that we relate to. Everything's a home, everything's a garden, everything's there's gates, and there's, all of a sudden it becomes familiar in the way that they're using it. And Star Wars is a good example of that. These alien worlds, these homes, but everything had a function. And so that's establishing time and place. You also establish your, it's good to establish your world. And this is all stuff you need to work out before you even before you even type one letter, one word or anything into your script. You need to establish this stuff. And then it needs to kind of be revealed. Like, you can take your time revealing these things, but you need to at least set some sort of initial, like, this is, some initial way that can catch the audience as you're writing, or as they're reading it, as they're reading the comic. There's a visual that hits them, there's a word that the character says, there's something, but you need to establish, like, oh, this character's like this character works in an office place, this character is a guard guarding some space station, but whatever it is, it's like it needs to be made clear. Otherwise, readers are just like, what's going on? Like, here's this character who's just kind of doing stuff, and then stuff happens, and they're like, I don't get the context. Context is everything. And I'll say that all the freaking time. And I know I'm kind of rambling, but just try to follow with me here. So, establish time, place, setting, characters. The other thing you have to do is, and this is why I hate writing the first chapter, because you have to also grab your audience with conflict. You can't, it's hard to just, like, come on in and then you can't jump right to the action. You could if you there's a couple plot devices that you can't. One of which is, it starts in the middle of the action, and then it, after kind of like maybe an initial like confrontation, some sort of battle, something, then it goes into how they got there, and then you can kind of go and revert. You have to go backwards and be able to at least tell readers how this happened. Otherwise, it's still just confusing. So you definitely always have to establish conflict and how characters came into conflict. Conflict is what drives story. I don't care who you are. I don't care what you're writing. You're writing, even let's look at sitcoms where conflict is pretty mild. Seinfeld, great example of a show that people always said was just about nothing. Fact of the matter is, that show always was about conflict. No matter how diluted or crazy, or, so it was always about conflict, though. And conflict is what drives story. I don't care what you're writing. You're writing a romance, whatever it is. Conflict is everything. But you have to establish your character is in their normal life, and then something happens that turns their life either upside down or makes things confusing or makes things difficult for them. That's conflict. So you have your protagonist, your main character, and ultimately maybe they, I think a good example, but even if you're writing like, say, a romance, you have a character that has always had this crush on this girl or something, and then in an office type setting, and just when they're about, and maybe they've been soul searching, and that kind of is how it starts. It's like life is kind of stagnant, and then, but you find out this character's been thinking a lot about things and really deciding, I'm just going to go for it. I'm going to do it. And as soon as they actually move and force themselves to action, some other guy comes in, sweeps the girl off her feet. She says, I know we've been friends forever, but I just want to invite you to my wedding. Something like that. And all of a sudden it's conflict because the guy, and it's very kind of internalized. I mean, you could go anywhere from there. The guy has to decide, what am I going to do? Am I going to break up the wedding? Am I going to try to, shrug it off and pursue other women? And it's like all of a sudden you have this conflict, and you have to figure out how that conflict gets characters from point A to point B. And ultimately, conflict is what drives the story to the climax, and climax is where everything kind of, where the story basically, it's the ultimate clash, In fantasy, it's always the ultimate battle between good and evil. It's always the moment in time where, it's the make or break deal, basically. And the beauty of something like a comic book format too is that it can be more like a soap opera than it has to be like an actual prose novel or a film, in the sense that you can have multiple climaxes and you can have multiple conflicts. But you have to start with something, and your first chapter always has to keep it a little more clear, a little more simple. Don't totally complicate your plots too much. Always have one initial conflict that gets the ball rolling, and then as it's going, you build momentum, and that's kind of rolling. Each issue kind of builds on conflicts, and you build tension. You introduce more characters that come in that have their own deal, and you have to deal with the fact that the way your main character deals with these guys, dealing with an ensemble cast, then you have to kind of deal with the fact that you have multiple characters and how they relate to each other as a group dynamic, and how they relate to one-on-one as like kind of a more like one-on-one dynamic, and how they relate to the world around them in their own way, their own idiom. You really have to hear all their voices. And so writers really have the pleasure and the curse of being, multiple personality disorder type victims, because we have to deal with being able to really hear those things. And you have to make that, you have to really establish where you're going to do with that, I think, right off the bat when you're starting your script. When you have to figure out, am I going to follow multiple characters? Even starting from the first chapter. Am I going to introduce conflicts that are going to kind of, especially chapter 1 should probably really deal with how one major conflict kind of engulfs all the characters. Maybe it's a family, and maybe something happens, like some sort of tragedy, and it affects everybody instantly, so that gets the ball rolling. And then you introduce minor conflicts with characters in their individual lives as they're branching out, and it's kind of like a timeline that goes. And without getting too complicated, that's the thing. You got to go to conflict, and it can be simple, but it has to start chapter 1 somehow, whether, like I said, whether you kind of work your way backwards and explain how it got there, or you just kind of start off with the initial life is great, or life is stagnant, or life sucks, but this is the way it is and always has been, and then all of a sudden something happens, and it's kind of like this, it's like life is good, and then, someone in the family dies and leaves everybody a fortune, and all of a sudden, because the family starts fighting about it. You can have any sort of it's a wonderful world. So that you think of multiple universes, think of the different possibilities that could definitely arise. So now that I've rambled, I hope that you can take away from this something of what I've said, but basically, what did I say? Establish your main characters, establish plot, establish place and setting, establish conflict, and you can do it all as much as you can without being overly, in chapter 1, do it all as much as you can in chapter 1 without being overly, what's the word? You don't want to overwhelm your readers, but you have to establish that, and again, establish relatability, establish suspension of disbelief. People have to believe. They have to. This is the main thing, that people have to believe that as they're reading it, people have to believe that this is real, characters are real. I know it's a comic, but I'm serious. Seriously. You've seen stuff, Sin City, there's so many movies right now that were based on graphic novels and comic book series, and honestly, the reason they get turned into films and the reason they get turned into other forms and they become so immensely popular, writers like Neil Gaiman and stuff, it's because these guys, the writing is so good. The writing is so immensely good. And it's because they establish a reality, something that so entirely reaches out and grabs you by the throat, and it's just like something that you can relate to. Characters, little drawings on the page, but man, you're reading it and you're just enthralled. So it's so important to establish that. There's something real about this. Your characters are real, your place and time is real, even if it's so absolutely fantasy or extraterrestrial or whatever. Make it real, make it relatable, and people will keep reading. And then, again, do all that first and create something that people can get into. And then, like I said, characters are like this, and then conflict, timeline change, kind of brings the arc is the action, and the arc is the forward movement of the script. So, I think that's what I was going to say today, but definitely you can do all those things in chapter 1 without overwhelming your audience, without talking down to your audience, without just really boring your audience, you can do all that stuff. It's hard. It's the reason I hate trying to start new scripts, start new stories in the comic book format sometimes. Because in a book you can do that over a course of in a book you can really kind of in a prose book, in a novel, written novel, you can kind of take your time in doing that a little bit, but you need to, that's a different story. You can do that in at least a few chapters, but we're talking, I think with a comic script you really have to get into it in the first 30 to 40 pages, which usually 30 is about standard for one issue or chapter. Some people have longer first ones. So that's the challenge. So think about that, and I hope to bring some more insights to the table at some point. So I guess I'll talk to you later.